Start the recording. Just in case you missed it, the first time I pasted it in there, I'm going to again paste in the list of learning outcomes here for this section on consciousness. This morning what we're going to do is take a look at several main topics. So let me just kind of give you guys a list of the major concepts we are going to be taking a look at this morning. We'll begin with a look at what we call circadian rhythms. So as we're going to learn, these are daily biological cycles that are about 24 hours or so in length. Then we're going to take a look at a typical night's sleep. We're going to be talking about the different stages of sleep that unfold over the course of a typical night. We're going to look at some theories of why we sleep. So we're going to have 3 of those to take a look at. We're going to talk about some sleep disorders. So what can go wrong, things like insomnia, and some other things you've probably heard about. Then we'll review a couple theories of why we dream. So not only theories of why we sleep, but also a couple theories of why we dream. And then the final section will be where we take a look at what we call psychoactive drugs. That will include things like depressants and sedatives, stimulants, hallucinogens, and even the opiates. So this is kind of the lay of the land for the day. The list of learning outcomes, again, is available to you there in the chat box. And hopefully by the time we get done today, we'll have a little bit of time at the end for the psychoactive drugs to take a look at a pretty both informative and entertaining website from the University of Utah. Believe it or not, they have a website called Mouse Party that shows you the effects of different psychoactive drugs on the brain. So it's a nice connection back in for us to the bio chapter, chapter 2. So hopefully we'll have time to get to that by the end. Minimally, I'll share that link to that website within the chat box for sure. Okay? So that's the list of, I guess, the 6 big things we'll be doing today. We talked about 5 big ideas in the section on perception on Tuesday when we got together face-to-face. These are the 6 big ideas for today's get-together online. So let's begin by taking a look at these circadian rhythms and what these are all about. I'll give you a little verbal summary here, and then we'll take a look at some of the biology that underlies these circadian rhythms in just a second. So circadian rhythms, as it says here, are daily biological cycles that are about 24 hours in length. The name actually tells you what it's about. Circa is the Latin word for about or approximately. DIA is the Latin root for the word day. So they're about a day. They're about 24 hours in length. Okay. Turns out that your sleep cycle is just a little bit longer than 24. It's more like 25 hours. The circadian rhythms we're interested in, obviously, in the section on consciousness, and when we talk about sleep, are going to be those related to your sleep-wake cycle. The circadian rhythms in this case are regulated by a group of neurons in the hypothalamus. So remember, the hypothalamus was one of our 3 limbic system structures. We had the little mnemonic of HA, right? So we talked about the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. The new word here really is nuclei. That's the plural, obviously, of nucleus. And a nucleus or nuclei refers to groups of neurons. Okay, so these are groups of neurons that are specialized, in this case, for helping us to set and reset our biological clocks over the course of about a 24-hour period. So if you want to think about it in terms of nature and nurture, or biology and environment, the nature part of the story here is what's going on within the hypothalamus. Okay? This is the biological piece that, in conjunction with the nurture or the environment, helps to set and reset our sleep clock. So environmental factors or nurture factors matter as well, and those include things like the day-night cycle, right? Is it bright and sunny out there, or is it dark and in the middle of the night? Generally speaking, people are going to be more likely to be sleepy, right, when it's the dark middle of the night. So that environmental piece, that nurture piece, works in conjunction with the nature piece right here in your hypothalamus. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So here is the light coming in from your environment. It's getting routed through the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Again, it's just a group of neurons, a cluster, if you will, of neurons. And then that has an impact on something called the pineal gland. I'm not going to ask you anything about the pineal gland, but when you are awake and alert, what we see is the suppression of melatonin production. So we could say there's an inverse relationship or a negative correlation between melatonin production and level of alertness, right? So in the middle of the day here, in the left side of this graphic, melatonin production is decreased, our level of alertness is increased, okay? In contrast, on the right side here at night now, melatonin is being produced. So as melatonin levels go up, what happens to our levels of alertness? Tell me in the chat box. If these are inversely related or negatively correlated, as melatonin levels go up at night, what happens to your levels of alertness as it approaches bedtime? Yeah, that stuff goes down, right? How sharp you are, how sort of cognitively with it you are, feels like it's dropping, and that's exactly what's going on here. As a function of this interplay, you can see it here, right, between the environment, that's obviously the environmental light source, and then what's going on here in terms of the biology, the hardware in your head. Again, this cluster of neurons called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or when we're talking about more than one of these, the suprachiasmatic nuclei. Okay, we're focused, as I said, on the sleep-wake cycle. You have other circadian rhythms as well, if you didn't know it, things like hunger or thirst, even when you feel like you need to go to the bathroom, different kinds of things like that are on these circadian rhythms of about 24 hours, right? It's pretty unusual for you to wake up at, let's say, 3 o'clock in the morning. If you went to bed at your normal bedtime, let's say it's 11 o'clock at night that you go to bed, it would be pretty unusual for you to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and feel ravenously hungry. Okay, we would expect that to happen. So that's the story in terms of circadian rhythms. Pretty simple idea. Questions about that at all? Does that make sense? Let me ask you this. Can you think of some things that might happen or things that you might do that could disrupt your sleep-wake cycle, that specific circadian rhythm? What kinds of things could be going on or things you might be doing that might disrupt these circadian rhythms in some way? Can you think of an example or two? I've got some in my head, but I don't just want to spout them out to you guys. Stephen looks like he's coming up with an example for us, so that's good. Yeah, late night parties. We can even leave the parties part out, and let's just say staying up later and later than usual, right? So let's say that your typical bedtime, as I said before, was maybe 11 o'clock at night. Okay, let's run with that. Well, Thursday night you stay up a little bit later. And Friday night you stay up later. And Saturday night you stay up really late, right? So let's say you have an 8-hour sleep cycle that's typically from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Well, if Saturday night you don't go to bed until 3 a.m., if we assume you get 8 hours when you go to bed at 3 a.m., you wake up at 11 on Sunday morning, right? Now let's slide ahead in the day on Sunday, and you realize you have an 8 a.m. test Monday morning, okay? And now you're trying to go to bed at 11 o'clock Sunday night after you woke up at 11 a.m. Sunday morning. Tell me what happens when you try to go to bed on Sunday night at 11 p.m. in preparation for that Monday test. Can you do it? Is it easy to fall asleep? No, probably what happens is you find it very difficult to fall asleep at that point, because effectively what you've done is you've pushed your 8-hour window of sleep from 11 to 7, as it typically is for you, to now 3 to 11. Okay, so it makes it hard to fall asleep at 11 Sunday night. It's certainly going to make it hard to wake up on Monday morning at 7 if maybe you don't fall asleep until 1 o'clock, let's say. Okay, something like that. So that's one way circadian rhythms can get disrupted. If you work shift work, right, you're a nurse or you're doing some kind of job where you work 12-hour shifts and maybe they are from 6 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning, that can disrupt circadian rhythms. Jet lag, right? If you're traveling over 3, 5, 8 time zones, when you get to wherever you're going, you can feel like things are out of whack, right? And I think this is where I now think, especially in the last several years when I've done these kinds of trips, not only do I notice it with respect to the sleep stuff, but also with respect to hunger, right? Have you guys ever had that experience, right? Maybe you fly to the East Coast, or you fly to Europe, or you fly wherever you're flying, right? And when you're going there, when you're coming back, you find yourself getting hungry at strange times, right? You're ravenously hungry at, 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 10 o'clock in the morning at a time when you wouldn't normally be eating breakfast or lunch or something like that. All right, so that's the story on circadian rhythms. Everybody got it? If you've got it, tell me in the chat box that you're with me, so I know. There are only 10 of you here, so I can give you lots of special attention. Okay, that's great. Well, what I want to do now is talk about some of the stages that are characteristic of a typical night's sleep. So we're going to talk about 5 major stages. We're going to talk about stages 1 through 4, and the separate and unique stage of sleep that we call REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. We'll get to that in just a bit. Let's do an overview of these different stages of sleep by taking a look at this graphic of what we're terming a typical night's sleep. Okay? Sometimes it's hard to imagine what that is. When you have a complicated life, maybe there's no typical night's sleep. But let's pretend we have a typical night's sleep. And as it says here on the graphic, a typical night's sleep has 4 to 5 multi-stage sleep cycles, each lasting approximately 90 minutes. Each cycle includes at least one NREM, which stands for non-rapid eye movement, and one REM stage. Pattern and duration of stages differ over the course of the night. Okay, great. What does this mean in English? Well, on the x-axis here, we're taking a look at hours of sleep over the course of a night. So let's keep running with my 11 p.m. example. So you go to bed here at 11 p.m. You wake up 8 hours later, if I'm doing the math right, at 7 a.m. Okay? What we're depicting here is some of the things that go on over the course of the night as you cycle through these various different stages of sleep. Okay? So let me summarize these for you. Okay? Oh, by the way, we're going to depict these things with this output. Where did we get this? Which of the tools of the neuroscientist did we use to come up with these brainwave tracings over here? Who's got it? That's not a PET scan, is it? No, it's not a PET scan. What the heck is that? That gives us information about what's going on at the level of the overlying cortex. That's an EEG. Yes, perfect. Thank you for that. So as you'll see, we have different kinds of brainwave tracings in these different stages of sleep. So let's begin with these 4 here and talk about the NREM, or non-rapid eye movement stages of sleep. And we'll begin with stage 1 right here. Stage 1 sleep, and we're going to drop the NREM and just call it stage 1, because everything other than REM sleep is NREM. So let's just call it stage 1. And during stage 1, we have very, very light sleep when we first fall asleep at night. So let me just type some words in over here for stage 1. So this is very light sleep when you first fall asleep at night. Okay? You might be lying in your bed reading a book. Maybe as you first fall asleep, the book falls onto your chest and you kind of wake up a little bit, or maybe in stage 1 you do a little bit of those sort of sleep twitchy things. As you're first falling to sleep, you're a little bit jumpy. Okay? We're getting a look at the brain waves here in that very first stage of sleep. You do not need to memorize the names of the different waves. I'm not going to ask you about alpha, beta, theta, and delta waves. That's more detail than we really need to know. Okay? What I want us to focus on is what are the major characteristics of each of these 4 stages of sleep. So stage 1, really light sleep. Stage 2, what happens in stage 2 sleep is that we are transitioning. So I'm going to call this transitional, and I'm going to tell you that we spend almost half of the night in this transitional stage 2 sleep. Why are we calling it transitional? Because it's the sleep that marks the movement from the lighter stage 1 sleep down into the deeper stage 3 and stage 4 sleep. So in its position here in sort of the hierarchy of the stages of sleep, it's kind of like the thalamus in some ways, right? Sensory information other than smell went through the thalamus. Sleep stages, as we go into deeper sleep or come back up from deeper sleep, like stages 3 and 4, necessarily go through stage 2. So it's this transitional sleep during which we spend almost half of our night. Okay? Stages 3 and 4 are very often looked at and considered in conjunction with each other, so we'll just roll them together and say that stages 3 and 4 are in combination with each other, known as slow wave sleep. So slow wave sleep characterizes both stages 3 and 4 here as we look at this typical night sleep. Okay. This is our deep sleep. This is also when, if we're doing any kind of sleep talking or sleep walking, that kind of stuff will occur. And when you look at the stage 4 sleep in particular, you get the idea of why they call this slow wave sleep. Do you see those waves there? These large amplitude, relatively low frequency brain waves. Remember, amplitude just refers to the height of the wave. So I'm trying to trace here the top of the wave to the bottom of the wave. That's a pretty tall wave there as we're in stage 4 sleep at this point. Okay? So that's a nice summary of the 4 major stages of the non-REM sleep. I'll get to REM sleep in just a minute. Okay? But that tells a story as we transition through these non-REM sleep stages over the course of a night. Okay? Let me stop there for a second. I know that Stephen had a question. Let's see what that is. Great question, Stephen. Probably a relatively normal length nap, let's say, 35 minutes to maybe 55 minutes, not a 2 or 3 hour nap, right? A relatively short nap. You probably aren't going much deeper than stage 2, okay? Almost certainly we would be shocked if you went into a REM episode during a light afternoon nap, right? So you take a nap maybe at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you wake back up before 3 o'clock, probably mostly in stage 1 and stage 2, okay? So look at the brainwave traces. Again, we're getting these from an EEG. That's something good to remember because it piggybacks onto what we talked about before. And these EEG brainwave tracings show us, remember, electrical activity at the level of the overlying cortex, right? So we're not looking at underlying brain areas, but we can see here what's going on as we go through these different stages of sleep, okay? Let me talk to you for a minute about some of the summary statements we can make about a typical night's sleep. Okay, I would say there are 3 things that I'd like you to know about a typical night's sleep. Number 1 is that we cycle through all of the stages over the course of a night. Right, you can see that pretty easily here in the graph down below, right? We're in 1, down into 2 and 3 and 4. We cycle back up. We've got a REM episode. We go back down into 2 and 3 and 4. We cycle back up. We've got a REM episode. So number 1, we are cycling through all the stages over the course of the night, okay? Number 2 point I want to make. Take a look at the graph, and I want you guys to help me draw this conclusion. As you look at the graph there, when does most of our stage 3 and stage 4 sleep tend to occur? In what part of the night? The first half of the night, second half of the night, somewhere in the middle? Where do we see most of the stage 3 and stage 4 sleep occur? That deeper, heavier sleep. Tell me in the chat box. When is that going on? Yeah, closer to the first half. So I'm going to say here, stage 3 and 4 occur earlier in the night. So if you have ever been awakened, right, let's say you did go to bed at 11 o'clock, and for some reason a crying baby wakes you up at, say, 12:45, 1 o'clock in the morning, an hour and a half, almost 2 hours into your night's sleep, it is really, really difficult to wake up at that point because you're likely to be in a stage 3 or stage 4 slow wave sleep, this pretty deep sleep, okay? The final thing I want to mention in terms of the REM episodes. Look at the REM episodes up above here. And this is how they graph these out. It's a little bit strange, but they actually throw the REM episodes up here on the graphs. What do you notice about the REM episodes over the course of the night's sleep? Well, if you look at the table, or I'm sorry, the graphic itself, it even spells it out for you, that the REM duration increases, okay? I actually think it's not only that, but it's more of those episodes. I'm going to type in here more and longer REM later in the night, okay? So these are really the three take-home points I'm summarizing for you up above here, right? We cycle through all the different stages. That's pretty clear, right? It's just the overall pattern here within this graphic. We get more of the 3 and 4 sleep going on earlier in the night. So that would be this stuff going on in here. And we get more and longer REM going on here later in the night. And that's this second little circle on the right side. Okay? Those are the take-home messages here in terms of the different stages of sleep that we go through during a typical night's sleep. Any question about those? I'm going to talk about REM sleep in a second, I promise, so don't worry about that yet. All right, it looks like we're good. Let's talk about that REM sleep. I want to mention one thing right off the top about REM sleep that I think is actually pretty fascinating. I'm going to tell you that REM sleep is often referred to as paradoxical sleep. Okay, paradoxical sleep. What's a paradox? Well, paradox is a seeming contradiction between two things that don't seem to go together. Well, the paradox here with REM sleep, and why we call it paradoxical sleep sometimes, is that if you look at the brainwave tracings here, right, it's kind of this lime green color, and contrast that, or compare that and contrast that with the awake brain waves, which we would assume this is you guys right now. They're not all that different, are they? If you look at this set of brainwave tracings here, and then the brainwave tracings right below it from REM sleep, they don't look dramatically different, do they? They look pretty darn similar. Well, it turns out that the paradox here is that those brainwave tracings, if that's all that you were looking at, would probably make you think that the person was, well, if we look right here, it looks like they're awake and alert, okay? But they're not. They're in REM sleep, and it turns out that REM sleep is some of the heaviest sleep of the night, where the person really looks dead to the world. They're not tossing and turning or anything like that, okay? So that's the paradox. The brainwave tracings from the EEG, from REM sleep episodes, looks pretty similar to the brainwave tracings of someone who is awake and alert. Okay? Again, the paradox is you are very far from being awake and alert. What's going on during REM sleep? Well, let's note a couple different characteristics here. There are rapid eye movements occurring. That's why it's called REM sleep. Okay, so if you've ever seen a brother or sister in REM sleep, maybe your dog or your cat in REM sleep, okay, the eyes are sort of zigzagging back and forth behind their eyelids. That's why it's called REM sleep. Okay? This is the point in the night where our most vivid dreaming is occurring. Okay? It turns out that we do dream during other stages of sleep, but that dreaming is much more plain, much more boring kind of stuff. Okay? What's going on here during REM sleep is this vivid dreaming. So if you had a dream about saving a dozen people from a burning building, or if you had a dream about winning some big award, or making the game-winning shot, or meeting the man or woman of your dreams, it's probably a REM sleep dream. Okay? The other more mundane dreams might be going on, let's say, during stage 3, or maybe in stage 4. Okay? You had a dream that you took your car in for an oil change, or you had a dream that you went to the laundromat to pick up your clothes, or so you're folding laundry, right? Something much more plain, much more boring, much more mundane. Okay. During REM sleep, we have increased physiological arousal. Without drawing any pictures or becoming overly graphic, my notes say here that our body is aroused in many ways. Okay. That physiological arousal, by the way, is mirrored by the brainwave tracings here from the EEG, isn't it? This is you awake, alert, and aroused cognitively as we're doing what we're doing right now. Here's your brain waves when you're sleeping. Those brain waves kind of mimic this physiological arousal that occurs during these REM sleep episodes. And then finally, there is muscle paralysis during REM sleep, which I'm going to argue is actually a good thing, because if you are having some of this vivid dreaming occurring during REM sleep, what's the good thing? Tell me in the chat box about the muscle paralysis here. While you're having these really vivid dreams, why is it a good thing that you're like a log and you're not tossing and turning and you're not moving? How is that a helpful thing? What might happen if you didn't have the muscle paralysis going on? Tell me in the chat box. What might you do if muscle paralysis was not occurring and you were having the vivid dream about saving people from a burning building, right? You won't walk off a bridge. You're not going to hurt anybody. You're not going to be, climbing out on the deck, right? Things like that. Okay, you're not going to be walking into walls, etc. In fact, there are some folks who don't have the muscle paralysis occur, and they suffer from something that's known as REM behavior disorder. Okay, so what happens with REM behavior disorder is that you don't get the muscle paralysis, and consequently you do see them sometimes crawling under the bed, like they're having a dream about being in a foxhole in World War II in combat. Okay, there's your vivid dreaming. There's your acting that out because the muscle paralysis is absent in someone who's got REM behavior disorder. Okay? All right, let me stop there for a second. Any questions about these various different stages of sleep? Stages 1 through 4, along with what we've summarized now for REM sleep. Does that make sense? Yes, Sarah, go ahead. Yeah, both of these are slow wave sleep. Thank you. Yeah, I tried to sort of combine these two down the bottom together because slow wave sleep is what they're referred to. Yep. Okay. Let me just mention briefly about some changes that we know that happen with REM sleep over the course of time. REM sleep at birth is about 50% of the night. Okay, so the white line here is a number of hours of sleep. And obviously what happens over time is that your amount of sleep per night goes down. So when you get to be 70, 80, and 90, you're down to maybe 6 hours of sleep versus when you're a newborn. At first year or so, you're sleeping more than 12 hours a day, which sounds incredible. And a greater percentage of those hours of sleep is spent in REM sleep. So you can see the green section here get thinner and thinner, which means you're having fewer and fewer hours of REM sleep. Maybe an hour, maybe even less than an hour as you get into older adulthood. Okay, so generally speaking, fewer hours of sleep as you get older, and then a smaller percentage of those hours is actually spent in REM sleep as people get older. Okay? Awesome. All right, I'm not going to beat that into the ground anymore because it seems like you guys have got your heads around it pretty well. What else did we say we were going to talk about today? Well, we said we'd talk about circadian rhythms, so let's start checking some things off. We talked about that. Stages of sleep, we talked about that. Okay, let's turn our attention now to different theories of why we sleep. And these theories, I think, are interesting because in a lot of ways they approach sleep from very different perspectives. They're not really looking at sleep from exactly the same point of view, and I'm going to try to be explicit about that on the front end because it makes it easier, I think, to distinguish between and among these different theories by realizing they're really approaching sleep from very different points of view. So let's talk about 3 theories of why we sleep. There is an individual level theory known as the restorative theory that looks at sleep from the perspective of what you or I might view as just a regular person thinking about sleep. So this is looking at sleep from an individual level, where we're going to be focusing in on recovering from the demands of the day. So we'll come back to that in a minute. The evolutionary theory looks at sleep from the perspective of us as a species. So this is a species level examination of sleep. And the consolidation theory down below is a theory that really looks at sleep from a biological perspective. Okay, what's going on here in terms of things occurring in our brains during a typical night's sleep. So let's begin with the restorative theory. I think of the restorative theory as the cell phone battery theory. Okay, so that's a nice way to remember this. This is the cell phone battery theory. What happens at the end of the day is we're getting down into the red zone, right? Not in the football game, but the red zone on our battery, and we know we need to recharge. We're so tired and worn out from the physical, cognitive, and emotional demands of the day, and what sleep allows us to do, as it says here, is to recharge our bodies and recover from the fatigue of the day, right? It's basically about recuperation, right? We use sleep to recuperate, to recover from all the demands, again, physical demands, cognitive and emotional demands of the day. We need to refresh ourselves so that we're ready to tackle the demands of the next day, and we do that by sleeping. Okay, this is a really common sense sort of model, right? This is you at the end of the day saying to your roommate, I'm totally fried, I can't concentrate anymore, I need to go to bed, I'll, pick up with some of the stuff I'm working on when I get up in the morning. Okay, I'll be refreshed at that point. Notice how different that is from our second theory here, which has, as I said before, has as its focus the species. So this says, from the evolutionary perspective, that the purpose of sleep is to increase our species' chances of survival. So as a species, we adapted to sleeping during the night, right? Homo sapiens adapted to sleeping during the night because that's when things are potentially dangerous for us, right? Why does it make sense for us to sleep at night and be awake during the day? What's dangerous for us at a species level at night? If you think back in the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens, why was the night a more dangerous time than the day? Can you think of what was going on at night that might have been a threat to early Homo sapiens? Yeah, predators, right? Lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, right? All those different kinds of predators are both more likely to be awake at night. And tell me about their vision at night versus our vision at night. Who sees better at night? Lions and tigers and bears, or us? Yeah, it's them, right? The animals see better at night than we do. So what we did was we evolved in a way to sort of give the night to them, and then we'll own the day. We'll be awake and alert and moving around during the day when they're generally sleeping, right? When you go to the zoo in the middle of the day, especially if it's a hot day, many of those animals are asleep. Great. Okay, so the things that want to eat us are sleeping during the day, they're awake at night. We'll go opposite. Okay, and from an evolutionary perspective, that ends up being a great adaptation, right? It increases our species' chances of survival. So this is a really different point of view, right? The level of analysis here is at the level of the species rather than being about you individually, right? You're probably not going to say to your roommate tonight, I'm going to go to bed because sleeping at night will enhance my species' chances of survival, right? You're going to get some strange looks if you say that, okay? So it's really about the point of view or the perspective that separates these different theories from each other. The final theory down the bottom is consolidation theory. It's a biological account that argues that sleep is in place to help strengthen the neuronal connections. When I say neuronal connections, the word I always think about is networks that serve as the basis for learning and memory. And I like this because that's where we're going in the next 2 chapters. Okay, we're going to be talking about learning and memory for the next 2 weeks straight on through. Okay, well, the biological underpinning of learning and memory is what goes on during the night as these networks are built within our brain. Here's the way I think about this final theory. It's kind of analogous to the work that might go on a freeway at night. Okay, they generally try not to do giant projects that involve construction on freeways or major thoroughfares right in the middle of rush hour in the morning or at the end of the day. Okay, those guys might start that project at 10 or 11 o'clock at night and work till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Okay, maybe 5 o'clock in the morning. In a similar way, your brain is building the connections, the networks that are the basis for learning and memory. And you might have even experienced this kind of in a weird, indirect way by, spending a lot of time working on a problem, thinking about some project you're working on, writing a paper, and you sort of sleep on it. And what happened the next morning when you woke up? You might have had a little bit of an insight, a little eureka moment where you're like, I think I've got a way to solve that problem that I've been struggling with. Okay, that's almost a glimpse at the effect of the building of these networks related to learning and memory that this theory says is going on during the night. Okay, so again, 3 really, really different theories in terms of their level of analysis, right? This is you going to bed because you're physically worn out. This is you going to bed because, well, over time, in the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens, it was adaptive for us to sleep at night and be awake during the day. And this final theory relates to kind of the ongoing building that's going on in your brain as neural networks are built to provide the foundation for things like learning and memory. Okay? Questions about those different theories? Do they make sense? If I were to ask you guys a question about this stuff on a test, what do you think that question might involve? What might I do? Well, I might describe someone presenting one of these theories. I might say you walk into a lecture hall and you realize this is not your calculus class, and the professor is talking about why Homo sapiens evolved to sleep at night and be awake during the day. Which theory is that really all about? Well, that sounds like evolutionary theory. Okay? Or I might give you a description, something like that, and ask you to give me the name of that theory. This is a nice little table from your textbook reviewing these major theories of why we sleep. So we've got restorative, evolutionary. They're calling it the consolidation theory here. Okay, there you go. So that maps on to what we've been talking about. Consolidation, aiding in consolidation of memories and learning. Evolutionary, it's got an adaptive function. Restorative allows for growth and repair of the body. And then some ways in which those things are reflected. So a nice way to sort of summarize what we talked about on the previous slide. All right, so let's go back to our to-do list for today, because I like checking things off, right? Third big topic was why we sleep. We've taken care of that. We're about halfway through our time together, and now we're halfway through our list of 6 things to do, so we're in good shape. We're going to talk about sleep disorders. What can go wrong with sleep? What sleep disorders do you guys know something about already? What sleep disorders have you heard about? Tell me in the chat box. I mean, obviously there's insomnia. Good, that's a good one, Sarah, right? Problems falling asleep, staying asleep, things like that. What other sleep disorders have you heard about? Narcolepsy. All right, Megan's got one called narcolepsy. We'll figure out what that one's about. The final one we're going to talk about is actually called sleep apnea. So let's talk about these various sleep disorders, beginning with Sarah's insomnia. I'm not saying she has it. I'm saying that was her answer. So insomnia here is a chronic inability to sleep normally, right? I would underline the chronic part, right? So you could have what is really short-term or acute insomnia. That's because maybe you drank too much caffeine, late at night. It's a chronic inability to sleep normally. It can manifest itself in terms of problems falling asleep, waking up a lot during the night, maybe when you do wake up having problems falling back to sleep, or waking up earlier than you planned to, right? So your alarm is set for 7. Early morning awakening might mean you wake up at 5:50, and you're like, oh, I still got an hour more sleep here, and you can't fall back to sleep, okay? What kinds of psychological disorders do you think might have a connection with problems with sleeplessness? That's what insomnia basically is, sleeplessness. If you had to guess, there are 2 major psychological disorders that have sleep disruptions related to insomnia that are connected with those disorders. Anybody want to take a guess? Sarah gets them both, right? Depression and anxiety. How does depression fit in? Well, if you're having negative thoughts about yourself, negative thoughts about your future, things like that, that can disrupt sleep. Anxiety, I think, is even easier to nail down as a contributor to problems falling asleep, for example, right? Why can't you fall asleep at night if you have an anxiety disorder? What are you doing as you're lying there in bed if you suffer from an anxiety disorder? Yeah, you're worrying about stuff, right? Your mind is racing, sort of tracing and tracking all the things that you could possibly fret and worry about. So insomnia is a major sleep disorder, and there's always, it seems like once a year there's some summary of, the number of people affected and the billions of dollars that it has on things in the economy and so forth. So insomnia is a pretty significant problem. Yeah, Stephen, type your question in the chat box, and then we'll talk about narcolepsy. Have you guys seen narcolepsy ever depicted in a movie or a TV show? I think it was depicted in Deuce Bigalow, Male Gigolo, one of the all-time Oscar-winning movies. It's not an Oscar-winning movie. But we'll talk about narcolepsy in a second here. I'm going to underline irresistible compulsion to sleep during the daytime. You could certainly have nightmares related to insomnia. So if you have one, Stephen, right, you have a nightmare, it might make returning to sleep difficult because you feel so scared or so upset by what happened in the nightmare. Yeah, that's certainly possible. So this narcolepsy involves people just having sudden onset sleep during the daytime, right? Sitting there having a conversation with someone in some class and they have narcolepsy and they just, in a really sort of abrupt way, they fall asleep, right? That's what narcolepsy is about. Certainly a pretty significant and potentially incapacitating problem, right? If you have problems with narcolepsy, it could make for dangerous situations for you and for others, right? In what situations would it be really dangerous for someone who has narcolepsy to be doing a certain kind of job? Can you think of certain jobs where you wouldn't want someone who is narcoleptic to be doing that job? What do you think? Yeah, I wouldn't want my bus driver or my pilot, right, to be someone who has narcolepsy for sure. The final category here for sleep disorders is sleep apnea. Construction workers, another good one for sure. Yeah, the surgeon falling asleep. That sounds like a bad comedy movie, right? With sleep apnea, the person is stopping breathing while asleep. Okay, so the key element here is the ceasing of the breathing while asleep. I had a chance to visit one of my brothers last week, and he's got sleep apnea, and he's got this, I think it's called a CPAP machine that he has to wear over his nose and mouth at night to force air into his system, right, so he can not stop breathing repeatedly through the night, because apparently you can stop breathing on the order of hundreds of times a night. Now think about that for a second. If we look back at our typical night's sleep here, what happens if you repeatedly stop getting oxygen into your system? What does your night's sleep look like here? Or, I guess to be even more direct, where do you not get if you're constantly being awakened because you're gasping for air? What changes in your sleep as a function of this sleep apnea? What are you unable to get to? Do you think you get down into that deeper stage 3 and stage 4 slow wave sleep if you're constantly being awakened and you're gasping for air? That's what it sounds like, by the way. It sounds like someone, popping out of the water, gasping for air. Okay? Yeah, it's going to be extremely disruptive to this typical night's sleep, and they're probably not going to get much 3 and 4 sleep. They may not be getting much of the REM sleep as well. So it can be really, really disruptive, and the person during the daytime complains of feeling tired all the time, very high levels of fatigue. I remember that was something my brother would complain about, just feeling like he was totally run down. I mean, it wasn't like, you know, he had 2 or 3 little ones waking him up every night or anything like that. It ultimately ended up being the sleep apnea. Here are the sleep disturbances that you can take a look at. We've reviewed narcolepsy. I mentioned earlier in brief comments REM sleep disorder. There's sleep apnea, insomnia, sleepwalking, sleep terrors. You guys can read about those. Maybe I'll give you a textbook-related question that expands beyond the big 3 that we're talking about here that are insomnia, narcolepsy, and sleep apnea. Questions about any of those? Excellent. All right. So what's next? We're going back to the to-do list, right? We've taken care of sleep disorders. We've got 2 things left to cover. We've got a half hour to do so. We're in good shape. Theories of why we dream. Well, we're going to talk about 2 of these, and they're going to have a pretty different point of focus, kind of like how the different theories of why we sleep approach that question from a different perspective. The theories of why we dream approach dreaming from pretty different perspectives as well. We have an activation synthesis model, and then we have something known as the psychoanalytic theory of dreams. So let's talk about how they're different. The activation synthesis model is a biological account of why we dream, whereas Freud's psychoanalytic theory, and this is one you probably have heard more about, is clearly a psychological account for why we dream. So let's talk about each of these. The activation synthesis theory, this biological model, basically says, here's what's going on when you're asleep. Biologically, the brainstem, and to be more specific, the pons. Remember, the pons was the bridge between higher and lower levels of your central nervous system. Well, the pons is firing messages. It's bombarding higher brain centers with random neural activity. And by higher brain centers, we can be more explicit here, it's bombarding the overlying cortex with random neural activity. So you know what? This first part is the activation part of activation synthesis. Where does the synthesis come in? Well, the cerebral cortex then interprets that activity and creates a dream. It's basically trying to account for, why are these messages coming from down below? Okay, here's why these messages are coming down from below. Here's what I can do with that input. I can do a synthesis that involves combining different elements here and creating a story, creating some kind of a dream. So I'm going to activate down below, and I'm going to synthesize up above, right? This is scientifically borne out. We know that biologically this is what's going on in your brain during a typical night's sleep, okay? So activation from below, synthesis, or the building of something, in this case, the building of a dream, the building of a story, if you will, is going on at the level of the overlying cortex. Okay? We can contrast that story, that account of why we dream, with a psychological account that goes back to Freud's theory, right? Freud's psychoanalytic theory of dreaming says that dreams symbolize wish fulfillment. Basically, this means that it's in our dreams that we can symbolically fulfill wishes that maybe we are not fulfilling during our waking hours, right? So if you do have that dream about saving people from a burning building, maybe what's happening there is symbolically during your dreams, you're able to get recognition that maybe you feel like you're not getting during your waking hours, during your quote-unquote real life, right? So you're yearning to have this sort of recognition and get praise from people, and it doesn't happen day after day after day after day, and what happens instead is this pops up during your dreams, right? Freud, by the way, said that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious, right? That was Freud's statement, that dreams are a great way of getting at unconscious material. Why does that matter? Well, as we mentioned back in week 1 of the course, Freud thought that it was that unconscious stuff, those unconscious conflicts that might cause you problems, like depression or anxiety or whatever the case might be. And as we will learn in the final segment of the course, he really, in treatment, wants to make this unconscious material conscious. So basically, Freud views dreams as a sort of peek behind the curtain, if you will, at what's going on at the level of the unconscious. Okay? He makes a contrast in his theory between the manifest content of the dream and the latent content of the dream. What's the difference here? Well, the manifest content is the story, or if you want a fancier word, the narrative, and the latent content would then be the underlying meaning of the dream. And the way that we get at that underlying meaning is by doing some sort of interpretation of the dream. Okay? So let me make up a dream here. Let's say I had a dream that I was going to be going on a vacation with some family and friends, and we were going to go to Las Vegas together. We were going to celebrate my cousin's birthday. Okay? We had this dream where we all, we gathered at Lindbergh Field. There was like a dozen people. We were all excited. We get on the plane. We fly to Vegas. We get to Vegas. We check into the hotel. We go to our separate rooms. We're going to meet back down in the lobby in 15 minutes. And I come back down, and no one is there. In fact, the hotel is completely abandoned. I'm the only person walking around in this giant hotel. Okay? That story I just told you, which content is that? Tell me in the chat box. As I related that story to you, what am I giving you there? Is that manifest content or is that latent content? It's not both. What did I just tell you? I just told you the story, right? That was the manifest content. So here's what happened. Or I had a dream that I was a penguin and I was dancing around with other penguins at a birthday party. I just made that one up. That's the manifest content. What's the latent content? It's the underlying meaning of that dream. What is this about? What does this tell me about something going on in my unconscious? Well, you guys get to play Freud for a second and interpret that dream of arriving in Vegas, and then when you go down to the lobby area to meet up with your friends, they're not there, and no one is there. The hotel is completely abandoned. Tell me in the chat box, what does that mean? Yeah, some fear of abandonment, some fear of isolation, something to do with not being connected with other people, something about loneliness. Who knows, right? This is the big problem, by the way, with dream interpretation, right? What's the big problem? How do I know that Sarah's analysis there, her interpretation, is correct or not? There's no way to know, right? That's her interpretation. Someone else might give you a different interpretation, and you're like, which one is right? I don't know. Which one do you think is right? Because there's no way to disprove, right? We can't say, well, that one's wrong because of this. Okay? That's a major problem in terms of the science of dream interpretation, if you want to put science in quotation marks there for dream interpretation. All right. Questions about either of these two theories of why we dream? Activation synthesis, the biological account, or Freud's psychoanalytic theory, this more psychologically focused account. All right, I'm tired of talking, so I'm going to take a couple minutes here and let you guys answer some questions. So let me turn the check mark into an ABCD scenario. Press one more button and get us to the first of two polling questions in a row here. Shane, a straight A student, remembers dreaming that he failed an important chemistry test. According to Freud, Shane's account of I dreamt that I failed a chemistry test represents what kind of content in his dream. So his story about failing a chemistry test. Is that paradoxical content, dissociated content, latent content, or manifest content? Give you guys 30 seconds to think your way through that one. All right, let's take a look at how you guys did with this one. All right, 7 out of 10 of you think it's manifest. It is. Tell me in your own words in the chat box. Why is this the manifest content of the dream? It's not the latent content. Why is it manifest and not latent? What do we have here? He's having this dream where he says, I dreamt I failed a chemistry test. There's no interpretation. He's just relaying the story, right? So again, the manifest content is just the story. If you then interpreted this, as Catherine is saying, right, and started talking about, well, this represents his fear of failure and his fear of disappointing his parents and blah, 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 right? Now you'd be getting into the underlying meaning, purportedly, right, of what was going on in that dream. All right, let's do another one. Which of the following sleep disorders would be the most incapacitating for a commercial bus driver? Incapacitating means it would make it difficult for him to be a good bus driver. Incapacitating means it messes up your performance. We've got about 20 minutes to get through the section on drugs and alcohol. So I'll give you guys another 20 seconds on this one. Alrighty then, let's take a look at the results for this one. That's even better, 9 out of 10 saying, yeah, this is narcolepsy, right? Insomnia could negatively affect him, but the most incapacitating thing would be if this was a guy who was going to suddenly fall asleep while driving the bus. That's obviously dangerous for himself and for other people on the bus and for other people around the bus. All right, let's go back to our checklist. Right? We're doing this in this kind of compulsive way. We've now talked about theories of why we dream. What's left? The final thing is to talk about what we're going to call psychoactive drugs. Psychoactive drugs, as we're going to learn in just a moment here, are chemicals that change our level of consciousness. The reason we have a section on drugs and alcohol in the consciousness chapter is because drugs alter your level of consciousness. So psychoactive drugs, we'll define them this way on the side, are chemicals that affect mental processes and behavior by temporarily changing conscious awareness. So here's why it's in consciousness. And it says it affects mental processes and behavior. That's how we define this whole field, right? Psychology is a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Well, we just reversed them, and now we're saying mental processes and behavior. So if you're wondering why would you talk about drugs in an intro psych class, it's because they change things. They make people do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. They change people's ways of thinking. They change people's kinds of emotions that they might have. That's why it's relevant here to an intro psych class. Let's talk about where we're going to ultimately go with drugs and alcohol when we get into the final segment on psych disorders within this course. We're going to be talking about tolerance and withdrawal again there. So I want to introduce the ideas here. For drugs like alcohol, for drugs like crystal methamphetamine, people can start to show what we call tolerance, which means that the person needs more and more and more of the drug to get the same effect that they used to get with less. Think about that for a second, right? This is how, for example, in my career at the VA Medical Center, when I was working in the alcohol and drug treatment program, we would have guys who would come in and would truthfully say to us, I've gotten to the point where I'm drinking 12 or 14 or 16 beers a day. And you might think, how, for the love of God, is it possible for someone to drink 16 beers a day? You know how it's possible? They develop incredible tolerance to alcohol. They used to get drunk on 2 beers, and then it takes 4. And they used to get drunk on 4 beers, and now it takes 7, right? They used to get drunk on 7 beers, and you get the idea, right? When we develop a tolerance, we need more and more and more of the drug to get the same effect that we used to get with less. On the flip side, we could talk about withdrawal, which is what happens when the person either cuts down or stops the drug taking completely. What you get in the aftermath of that very often is a combination of physical and psychological symptoms. Physical withdrawal symptoms might include things like headaches, nausea, vomiting. Psychological symptoms might include problems with memory, problems concentrating, becoming really emotional, crying really easily, becoming angry really easily. Those are some of the physical and psychological symptoms you could see that would be indicators of withdrawal. Okay? So again, withdrawal is when you stop. What happens in the aftermath of that, either reduction or complete stoppage of the drug and alcohol use. And it's important for you to note here that it's these two characteristics, the tolerance and the withdrawal, that really defines what we call, as clinical psychologists, physiological dependence. Okay? Physiological dependence is the diagnostic term that's used to refer to what the layperson typically would call addiction. Okay? There is no word addiction in the diagnostic system that we use to classify psychological disorders. We don't say the word addiction. We talk about physiological dependence. And the idea here with physiological dependence is that you've got a physical system that has become reliant on having this drug or this alcohol in the system for it to function, quote unquote, normally, right? Tolerance means, again, we need more and more and more to get the same effect that I used to get with less. And withdrawal means when I stop or I cut down, I'm not feeling so good, okay, physically and or psychologically. Okay? Those are the defining features of physiological dependence. Again, a situation where your physical system has become dependent on having those drugs or the alcohol present. So let me stop there for a second. Questions about tolerance or withdrawal, how these things might work, how they relate to each other. All right, what I want to do in the last few minutes here, before we take a look at the Mouse Party website, is I want to review these major categories of drugs. We're going to talk about depressants and sedatives. We're going to talk about stimulants. We're going to talk about hallucinogens, and we're going to talk about opiates. So let's talk about each of these in turn. So category number one, the depressants and sedatives. What do you think they do to activity in your central nervous system? Tell me in the chat box. What do they do to CNS activity in your brain and spinal cord? They're called depressants or sedatives. Do you think they speed things up? Do you think they slow things down? Yeah, they slow things down. So I'm going to just type in here, they decrease CNS activity. So alcohol, if you didn't know, is a CNS depressant. Okay, it slows things down. Okay, barbiturates and benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax slow things down. We talked about Valium and Xanax as inhibitory, right? As having inhibitory effects on neurotransmission. Okay, so these are all things that will slow things down. Okay, central nervous system decreases its activity. Stimulants work in the opposite direction. Rather than decreasing CNS activity, the stimulants are going to increase CNS activity. Okay, they're going to stir things up and make things more active. In this category, we've got amphetamines, caffeine, nicotine, cocaine, crack, ecstasy. All of them would fall under the stimulant category. Okay, so the person becomes more active. What other effects do you get with stimulants? Well, you can get decreased appetite. So sometimes you'll see people use stimulants as a way to try to lose weight. It's not really the best and safest way to do it. At high levels of stimulant use, and I had a lot of experience working with guys whose drug of choice was crystal methamphetamine, you can actually see problems with paranoia with high levels of stimulant use. People start worrying, for example, you know, that you're working for the cops and you're going to call the feds on them and they're going to end up in prison. Okay? They start talking about things like that. You're pretty sure that they've relapsed into the crystal methamphetamine use because that kind of paranoia crops up in the context of that kind of stimulant use. Okay? So we've got those moving in opposite directions. We've got stimulants as a third category here, which are drugs that can generate hallucinations. Okay? They can make you see things and hear things that are not present. In this category, we've got marijuana, LSD, and PCP. Okay? All examples of drugs that have hallucinogenic properties. The final category is called the opiates. These are narcotics or painkillers. In this category, we've got morphine, heroin, and codeine. I would just mention briefly in passing about the opiates. What is striking about the opiates is the difficulty with which people try to recover and stop using opiates. It's extremely difficult to get opiate-dependent folks to stop using opiates. Okay, so if somebody is addicted to heroin, okay, relapse rates for opiate dependence 1 year post-treatment are like 90% and higher. Okay, it means 9 out of 10 or more of folks with opiate dependence are back to using the heroin, for example, a year after we've given them some kind of a treatment. Okay, the overall relapse rates for all the different drugs is around 2/3. So basically 2/3 of folks who have received treatment for a substance problem, 2/3 of them are back to using that substance a year later. Okay, again, the relapse rates for opiate dependence are crazy high. 90% or more. Extremely difficult to treat that. All right? Let me stop there for a second. Questions about the various psychoactive drugs? Okay. I'm going to go to the Mouse Party website now, and I'm going to copy and paste that into your chat box. You're going to hear some music in the background. They've got a funky background set of music that plays when you log into the site. I'm going to try to do what's called an app share, where I'm going to push my screen to your screen. So let me do a couple things here to make that happen. Now you should be seeing my desktop. And I'm going to walk you guys through this Mouse Party. So it says here, take a look inside the brains of mice on drugs. Every drug of abuse has its own unique molecular mechanism. You'll learn how these various drugs disrupt the synapse to make the user feel high. So let's click through here. And what we're going to get is various mice here using different drugs. There's the heroin mouse, ecstasy, marijuana, methamphetamine, alcohol. Let's grab him. I'm going to drop him in the chair, and we're going to learn about the effects of alcohol on your brain at the cellular level.
Inhibitory neurotransmitters called GABA are active throughout the brain. These neurotransmitters act to control neural activity along many brain pathways. When GABA binds to its receptor, the cell is less likely to fire.
Okay, so we learned about GABA as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. This is what things like Valium and Xanax affect as well. Here we're talking about alcohol. So alcohol is maybe going to have an impact on GABA. Let's see. You know alcohol is a depressant or a sedative. Let's see what it does with GABA.
Meanwhile, in another area of the brain, another neurotransmitter called glutamate acts as the brain's general-purpose excitatory neurotransmitter.
Okay, so glutamate is excitatory, and GABA is inhibitory. Let's see what it's going to do to each of those when we use alcohol.
When alcohol enters the brain, it delivers a double sedative punch. First, it interacts with GABA receptors to make them even more inhibitory.
So it makes the GABA inhibition greater.
Second, it binds to glutamate receptors, preventing the glutamate from exciting the cell.
And it keeps the excitation that would typically occur via glutamate from happening. So it increases inhibition and stops excitation. That's why it's a sedative, right? That's why alcohol has sedative effects.
Alcohol particularly affects areas of the brain involved in memory formation, decision-making, and impulse control.
Impulse control. Interesting. Do people do impulsive, stupid, crazy things when they're drunk? Absolutely. Let's look at one more mouse here before we wrap up for the day. Let's go to the cocaine mouse. And drop him in the chair there and see what cocaine does to the brain.
Dopamine neurotransporters are responsible for removing dopamine molecules from the synaptic cleft after they have done their job.
Okay. So dopamine transporters basically vacuum up dopamine neurotransmitters after the dopamine neurotransmitters have gone and done the binding to the receptor site. So they remove them. Okay. Dopamine is excitatory, by the way. Let's see what happens.
Cocaine blocks these transporters, leaving dopamine trapped in the synaptic cleft. As a result, dopamine binds again and again to the receptors, overstimulating the cell.
So it turns off the vacuum of the dopamine via the dopamine transporters and leaves the dopamine in the synapse here to repeatedly fire and stimulate that postsynaptic neuron.
Like other drugs, cocaine concentrates in the reward pathway. However, it is also active in the part of the brain controlling voluntary movements. This is why cocaine abusers are fidgety and unable to be still.
Interesting. All right, let's eject that mouse. I'm going to kill out of this tab here because it's just going to keep playing the music. A really cool site to check out and sort of connect in what we're talking about today regarding drugs and alcohol with what we learned previously about parts of the brain. So let me kill out of that, jump back in with you guys here. And I don't know where that went. All right, let's see. That's not what I want to do. Are you guys still there? Can you still hear me? Okay, I'm trying to quit out. And let's see if I do this. There we go. That a boy. Good job, Mark. All right. Jumping back into my slides here. There we are. Final questions on anything from today? You guys like the mouse party? How many of you guys have ever seen that before? A couple people left too. That was rude. All right, well, that's everything for today. This sets us up really nicely for next week, which is going to be entirely about learning. On Tuesday, we're going to talk about classical conditioning. On Thursday, we're going to talk about operant conditioning. That will be our focus next week. Since we have finished 2 chapters this week, Chapter 3 on sensation and perception and Chapter 4 on consciousness, you have 2 full sets of learning curve quizzes to get done by 11 p.m. Sunday night, so please make sure you get those done. And then my final little announcement is today's online office hours will be from 11 to just before 11:30. I've got another 11:30 lunch meeting that I've got to run to, but if you need anything, you can always email me. You know I'm pretty quick to respond to email, so I'm always reachable that way. All right? Any final questions before we get out of here for today? Awesome. Have a great day. Don't forget to X out of here so I can make the recording available for your classmates. I'll see you back in AL 201 on Tuesday. Thanks, guys.